G'day and welcome. This is Eric Perez. Thank you for joining us again on Talking Leadership. I'd like to introduce today's podcast guest. She is the Director of Knowledge with the Australian Institute of Police Management. Can I welcome to the podcast Dr. Victoria Herrington? How are you, Vicky?
I'm great, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. So, okay, let's start where I always start with the podcast. You've had leadership experience. You're doing what you're doing with the AIPM. What's been your journey in 200 words or less to get to where you are today?
It probably makes sense. I'm not sure how many of your listeners understand what the AIPM is, but it probably makes sense to just flesh that out a little bit more. So
Sure.
We're a national common police service, which means we're owned by all the police jurisdictions across Australia and New Zealand. And our board, if you like, is all the commissioners of the jurisdictions across Australia and New Zealand. And our focus is providing leadership, development and educational opportunities for executives across the public safety environments. And while we're owned by police, we actually think quite expansively about our role across public safety, including fire service and sort of some of the broader emergency services as well. So we have this kind of broad remit, if you like, to provide education and leadership development across public safety. I started at the AIPM about 10 years ago now, having transitioned across from a traditional academic role. I'm a criminologist by training. I've a PhDs looking at ability in prisons. For example, I've got a long history of working as a researcher across the criminal justice system. And about 10 years ago, I was tapped on the shoulder and asked to come across to set up an inaugural research and learning function at AIPM, which was a little bit about thought leadership, a little bit about educational accreditation, so managing sort of the accreditation architecture which governs our graduate programs, and a little bit about sort of thinking what the strategic direction in terms of research and learning was for the Australian Institute of Police Management. Now that over time has morphed into a slightly bigger role, more encompassing of knowledge more broadly. So I suppose what my role at the moment is the creation, the curation and the communication of knowledge related to public safety leadership. So when I think about leadership, I actually think less about myself in leadership and more intellectually about what does that mean for the public safety professions? What are the challenges we face? What's the literature telling us? What might we choose to do differently? So that's really kind of where I sit, if you like, in the context of thinking about leadership.
From a macro perspective, that's quite an interesting place to be, because a lot of the leaders I've spoken to on the podcast have been in that role themselves and are talking from that perspective, and you're coming from it from a slightly different angle again, which is great because it allowed me to ask some of the questions I've got in a slightly different way. And you'll see what I mean when I pose some of the questions to you, because the almost that outsider effect that you're looking at leadership from an outside lens, that you're not in it because you're delivering courses or delivering thought leadership to your clientele. Is that fair call?
I think that's absolutely a fair call at one level of analysis. And I think another level of analysis is what is leadership, right? So, essentially, I look at my kids. I've got two small children, 4 and 6, and I look at the way they play with their friends and I see leadership emerging, right? Because it's about, well, how do we coordinate this group of, entirely self-interested, early primary age children to actually affect a game that's working well, or to affect, an adventure that they're going on. So I think it depends what you think of as leadership. If you think of leadership as a formal authority role where you're imbued with this power to be able to do whatever you want effectively, well, sure, right, I don't run the organization. In policing, I'm effectively an unsworn or an academic. So, even if you had a positional authority, I'm not sure how much actual authority you would have. Leadership is also about creating coalitions. Leadership is also about generating support behind an idea. It's about being able to, weave, if you like, a system that enables you to progress the things that you do. So the fact that I came in as an inaugural member of the AIPM to look at research and learning and set up a research and learning portfolio, the fact that we've managed to do that successfully, the fact that we have been able to demonstrate our value to the profession around thought leadership, I think maybe by another name is personal leadership as well. opportunity to look at things from both sides. My natural inclination, because I'm an academic, is to intellectualize these things. But, you probably could analyze the work that personally I've done at a leadership level too. But it's not a natural place for me to do that.
You've gone to an area that I wanted to expand on in these podcasts at some stage, and I'm going to do it now. So this is an inaugural step to the side, but looking forward, how do you define leadership for yourself? And I think from the definitions that have come in a roundabout way from my guests, because I haven't really strictly asked, well, give me your exact definition of leadership. And I think if I did, I would get a slightly different definition from each person that I'm talking to. There'll be some commonalities, obviously, but I think and I bring my own lens here. I'm doing my own and postgraduate studies in leadership development, and from what I'm reading and the more that I talk to people, that the complex nature of how people interact at work, let alone what leadership looks like in a work context, there are subtleties and there are some complexities there that people don't often think about. And so again, this is great to have this discussion because there are layers to this. And I guess from the other side of the coin, and something I want to do a lot more in these podcasts, and thank you for this discussion because it's solidified it in my own mind that I'm talking to a lot of really, really good-hearted people that want to share their stories around leadership or what their thoughts are on leadership, like the conversation we're having now. But one thing that I haven't done a lot of is talk to people who are not leaders but are the led. What are their views of leadership? What do they want to see in their leaders? And I'm trying to do this in a 360 way to get every aspect of leadership I can talked about as much as is humanly possible on a podcast. And one of the things that I'm interested in is asking the question of those that aren't in leadership positions. What do you look for in a leader? Do you want to be inspired? What do you seek from them? Because I often get what the leader says are their key leadership capabilities and what they need to be effective leaders, which is important to know, but they're also leading people. So what do the led want to see? And I don't think that's often asked. And I think there's some gold in that conversation. And it's not the conversation that we're going to have. I've had some podcast guests in the last couple of weeks that have done the same. And I keep coming back to this issue that the definitional aspects of leadership are important. So let me ask you the question straight out. For you, how do you define leadership?
It is a good question. And for me, I suppose it's about making progress on tricky problems, on wicked problems, on complex problems. It's about making progress. But I like the point you make about asking the led what they want from their leaders. And we all can kind of call to mind those people we've really enjoyed working for, who have inspired us, who have challenged us, who have lifted us up. And we can also, I'm sure, spend significant amounts of time bitching about our leader, right?
But we won't do that. We'll stay positive.
I've been really blessed in my career, I think, about being able to work.
I haven't. Really so I don't want to open up that rabbit hole. But yeah, I get where you're coming from. Yes.
But the point I wanted to make was that when you think, oftentimes when you ask people what they want and actually what they really want, they might be two different things. So Ron Heifetz, who's a professor at Harvard, talks about, what we look for in leaders is direction, protection, and a sense of order. If you don't give direction, protection, and a sense of order, then you're thwarting people's expectations about what leaders should do. However, if you give direction, protection, and a sense of order, you're not actually engaging in leadership, because leadership is about making progress on complex problems. And this means that you need to, create in some ways a sense of upsetting the status quo. You need to challenge people. And Ron Heifetz talks about, hold people in the sense of disequilibrium, which is this kind of uncomfortable space between going, righto, I know what I'm doing, happy days, I'll just crack on, the boss has told me what to do. And the boss saying, you know what, I don't know what we're doing, because actually we're trying to make progress. And actually, this is going to feel uncomfortable. This is going to challenge your underlying beliefs. It's going to challenge the kind of extant culture in our organization or our society. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. So I have, when I think about asking the led, as it were, what they want from their leaders, my suspicion is that they will say someone who empowers them, or someone, all the same sorts of things that I would say if you ask me. But actually, what I think they really want is direction, protection, and a sense of order. And when that's thwarted, then I think the real work of leadership starts.
It's interesting to me that you talk about what people will say that they think I might, or someone wants to hear about what they want out of a leader versus what the deeper underlying values and or capabilities they want out of their leaders. And maybe offline we'll talk about how to get to those, because it's a research area for me, being an early career researcher, that I really want to get more into, because I guess, and I can never say this with a straight face, that I've now mastered what it is that leadership is, and I'll go forth and do something else to advance the thinking. One of the papers that I read in doing my thesis is around how many theories of leadership there are, and one paper that was written in 2016 by Din and her colleagues identified 66 different leadership theories. And when I started to look at them, I went, oh my God. So what I'm seeing is that the constant questioning and looking at leadership from the different lenses is a healthy thing to do, and it's part of the academic process and the research process. But the other thing I think I'm seeing, and I don't think I'm the first one to identify this, so I'm not going to claim it, is that the more useful theories into the future, I think, and this is just a guess here, will be those that integrate multiple different disciplines around what does the leadership construct look like from a multidisciplinary view of the world, not just one field looking at leadership. That's my guess. Why I say that, look, we might leave that for another podcast, but enough to say that it's a complex area, and it's only becoming more interesting for me, because until I was sort of challenged on, well, you're just talking to leaders, who else have you excluded from this picture? And it got me thinking, well, all right, so those that are in the workplace, asking those questions that I brought up before is going to be interesting. But then I guess the flip side to that is putting a proposition to people that aren't in any particular leadership role. And I'm not talking about power relationships. Just if you go to work and you've got bosses and you've got leaders, if the proposition was put to the staff, the people that make the organization run, what is it that ultimately is good leadership? What does good look like to you in terms of that leadership space? I think you might get some interesting answers around what does good feel like, because this idea that everyone's going to say the same thing, I don't think is going to wash. Because one thing that is been brought up to me several times, either on the podcast or in preparation for these discussions, is when you're talking about leadership in general, the question often becomes, is it a power thing, or can you be a leader without the title and demonstrate leadership behaviors that will take the organization forward? And that opened up this whole new world of thinking around, well, what about leadership in the volunteer space? Because leaders in that space aren't being paid to do roles that are volunteer roles. They're there for other reasons other than getting paid. And so the profit motive is not one of the elements of being in a leadership position in the volunteer space. It's another complicated space, but enough to say this topic is only getting more interesting to me. And so these conversations are the ones that I think people need to be engaging in if they have any interest in this. And the fact that we all go to work and we have these dynamics at play, understanding what these things look like is, I don't think, necessarily a bad thing. Do you believe that there is a qualitative difference between the leadership and managerial function?
If you don't mind, just going back to the previous point you made about can you be a leader without title? And I think absolutely that's essential. I think we can. And if anything, all frameworks and theories are flawed, but some are useful. So I don't know that there is this kind of, silver bullet theory out there that's all of a sudden going to reveal itself and we'll all be, that's what leadership's about, because these things are contested, right? And that's fine, and that's good, and that's helpful to get us to provoke us to think deeply about leadership, but maybe it shouldn't be our guide as to what we should do next. So I sit in this applied space, so I still feel like I'm an academic, but I sit in this applied world where I'm interested in what are the useful bits of theories that we can take to either help make sense of what we're experiencing as leaders in public safety organizations. So, and also what might be some of the challenges that we face as we are navigating this difference in many ways between management and leadership, as well as we're navigating this space between status quo and making progress. So what are the useful bits of those theories that we can move across? But it's absolutely essential, I think, that your title in many ways is not that's just a title, right? That doesn't actually confer your ability to engage in leadership behavior. And we see throughout public safety organizations, there are many people across the organization, right down the bottom of the pyramid, who are exercising leadership on a daily basis. So in some ways, having a title can be a hindrance to being able to engage in leadership activity, but with a title, people automatically defer to your power, to your authority. So you don't need to use leadership, right? You just say, I say, you do, away we go. That's not leadership, right? That's using your power. That's using your command, I suppose. It's command and control. But actually, does that actually help us make progress? Or does that just kind of reinforce the things that we're already doing? But to your point about leadership and management, which is, it's one of those ones that you hear a lot, is there a difference between leadership management? And, part of me is like, how can I say this politely? A bit bored with that question, I suppose.
Yeah, sure.
I don't mean that to be offensive in any way, because I think it's a natural question that people have as they come into this leadership space. So what's the difference in leadership and management? I'm like, does it matter? Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe I'm not in their shoes. So maybe I'm not thinking things from their perspective. But management for me is about you manage a process. It's procedural. It's often embedded in our standard operating procedures. It's following the rules and ensuring everybody else does the same. In my mind, that's kind of, in a nutshell, what I see management as. But, obviously leadership is maybe thinking outside of that structure. It's about thinking outside of what the existing rules, regulations, procedures, preferences, cultures are. It's about it's about seeing beyond, if you like, this iron cage of bureaucracy that we find ourselves in public safety organisations, and trying to find and weave and make sense of a way forward, a way to take us to the next place without necessarily knowing exactly what that next place is. So that for me is kind of the difference.
My definition is becoming more refined about what I think leadership is. And for me, it's definitely of being of service to others. That for me, philosophically, is where I come from with leadership. And I hope I'm putting that into practice in my 9-to-5 job, that I'm trying to do for others, not just for me. I mean, what's in a title? When I was younger, title meant a lot more than it does now. I think I'd rather just have a nice conversation and extend my brain out than worry about chasing the title. And unfortunately, when you're young, you don't know that maybe that's a hollow pursuit, because does it really matter? Like, going back to your question before, does it matter if you have the title or not? If people are following you, if you're inspiring people to do better and then you do better, or you're helping to be a conduit for better practice of others, and being that, what's the word that they use? Being a good faith stakeholder in whatever industry that you're in. I think that's a good thing long term.
And I think it goes to your point about, or the earlier point about, what is leadership, right? Because I think we grow up in our communities, in our families, and certainly in our schools, to kind of believe that the leader is the person standing at the front pointing the direction. And if you think of that as, that I have to get to be the person at the front leading the direction in order to make progress on whatever issues are concerning me, and in my world, obviously public safety issues. But actually, if you recognize that leadership is not necessarily about having the most pips on your shoulder or being at the front leading the charge, leadership is emergent from the group that you operate with. You have power without title. You may not choose to use that power, but you absolutely have power. And even if you think, you turn the issue on its head, and you think about how many quote unquote cultural change initiatives have been through policing and public safety organisations and have had minimal change, may have made a minimal difference. So it almost doesn't matter if you're leading the charge at the front. The power is being exerted by people elsewhere in your organisational system. So that at the very least should tell you, hang on, we've got a lot of power. How might we choose to use them? So I think that's an important piece, that we might aspire to be the person at the front of the class, or the person at the head of the family, or the person at the top of the organisation, because we feel that's the only way we will have sufficient power in order to kind of shape the organisation, the cause, whatever, to the way that we think things should look. But actually, you'll probably find when you get there, you maybe aren't able to pull as many levers as you think you are. And it can be a deeply, I guess, unsatisfactory or unsatisfying place to find oneself. And I wonder oftentimes, as we see people climb the greasy pole and, do everything for the promotion, because with the promotion, of course, I will be able to exert more power. Sure, you might have more authority. Sure, you might be able to kick a few more asses. But actually, if you really want to make a difference, you need to think about your leadership. And also the leadership resources you have within your organization through these other power networks in a slightly different way. And so that's how we talk and how we think about leadership at the AIPM. And that's the conversations we have with public safety professionals who are already at very senior levels. So they come to us when they are, either upper middle management or on the cusp of senior executive. And that's when you've got a bit of experience behind you that says, you know what, I tried to do X and that didn't work. And okay, well, let's unpack why. Let's actually understand what leadership looks like.
It's a good thing to hear that there are organisations that have those conversations with their members, because I think from I just guess from a dollar and cents perspective that there are upting millions, hundreds of millions of dollars spent around the globe on leadership development and trying to get better leadership. And I have a feeling now, I don't have research to back this, so this is a gut feel only, and I'm sure I'll get shot down. But my sense of this is that a lot of the leadership programs that are offered are really are tailored to, in some respects, deliver very good and high quality professional development, but whether or not they hit the mark in terms of long-term change in how you are as a leader, I'm not sure. And it's not a critique of the people delivering the programs. It's more, how do you set up a system to track whether there's been an effect to the training or the program that you've gone under longer term? I think I've learnt more from the lumps and bumps of doing the job and having the high pressure situations and having some wins and some losses, and that's where I've done a lot of my learning, and not necessarily any training that I've received. And again, it's not a critique of those delivering the training, because I think, like anything, 99% of those that are delivering these things have got good intentions and are trying to deliver something that they think is going to make a difference in the workplace, which is great. I struggle with finding a program that I've yet to see yet that the participants are tracked over time, like longitudinal work, to say, okay, you did this training in year X. It's now 5 years later. What was the change over that time in your leadership capability? And can you really peg that change to the training, or is it because you've had life experience? I'm not quite sure what the answer to that question is. So again, interesting space. Myself personally don't deliver leadership training. So for those listening, please don't jump down my throat on this. I'm just expressing some views. They could be wrong. They're just a view. It's one opinion. My opinion is based on the industries that I've worked in. And I think the test for this is, if you believe you got something out of that training and it's made you a better leader, then great. But I think if organizations and the public, and in my industry, public monies are used to develop your industry, then you need to be accountable for those monies. And I'm not sure for every bit of training in every industry sector, not just where I work, but across the board. If I ask the question, are we getting better leaders? Sorry, I'll rephrase that. Are we getting more effective leadership from those interventions, or what is happening from those interventions? And it's hard to track, because how do you set something like that up? And then what metrics do you use that are going to be applicable to, is it industry specific? Is it global? My industry, which is the commercial seafood industry, is very different to the sector that you work in. I don't know whether there's going to be some commonalities, obviously, but there's going to be some very big differences. So what are your thoughts on that, Vicky?
Yeah, look, there's a few things in there that I think are worth thinking about. And the first thing is, the impact that a 2-week program or a 6-month online qualification are going to have on one's own leadership behaviour is always going to, subsequent leadership behaviour is always going to be a little bit questionable. Particularly when you think about, as I mentioned earlier, I watch my kids play, and I recognise that they are learning about leadership. They are learning about how to coordinate a group of people from that age, and they're 4 and 6, right? So this is a lifelong journey that folk are on to, get to my middle age now and think, okay, well, what kind of leader am I, or what kind of leadership do I engage in, or what does the system need? How can I best navigate my environment? So I suppose on the one hand, okay, well, let's think about leadership as a lifelong journey rather than just, or learning about leadership as a lifelong journey rather than just something I picked up from a course I went on. So I think that's a really important point, because it goes to the second point about, well, how do you measure the impact that course you've gone on has? because this course is happening in the context of probably a 20-year professional career, maybe a 40-year, life. So how do you actually measure unpick the particular impact that program has had? Now, I couldn't agree with you more that you have to be accountable for the expenditure of public funds, and that includes in leadership development. I also recognise that measuring the success of leadership development programs is a problem across professions and across the entire bazillion-dollar industry of leadership development.
Yep.
What we did at AIPM, so we did want to invest in thinking about how we could measure the success of our programs, because we wanted to be able to tell the jurisdictions that were coming to our programs that you were getting bang for buck. So we had a reasonably traditional pre-post measurement and research or evaluation schedule. We looked at the self-reported confidence abilities, if you like, along a range of executive capabilities which are set out by the Australian Public Service. So we looked at the senior executive leadership capability framework, and we were able to say, okay, well, this is what we should be able to achieve through an executive leadership program. So how do you feel about yourself before the program? How do you feel about yourself after the program? And then we did a longitudinal follow-up, 1-2 years later. How do you feel about it now? So we were able we felt more comfortable being able to say, look, if you were like this before, and then you're a bit different afterwards, and if that is a difference that maintains into the longer term, well, then we can be reasonably confident that the only thing that's changed is this 2-week block that you were Manly doing your
gotcha. Yep.
Leadership program.
Yep.
So we were able to do that, but we tried also to triangulate, if you like, one's own assessments of how awesome I am, along with what my manager thought of me, and also what my colleagues thought of me. It's much more tricky to do, to try and encourage people to fill in the surveys. Number one, that's a perennial research problem, right? And then trying to, again, align what the individual felt versus what the manager or the subordinate felt. And also then trying to hold in mind, yes, but other people's expectations of leadership are not necessarily a more valid assessment of what leadership is you're engaging in, for all of the reasons we spoke before about expectations around direction, protection, a sense of order, whether or not that's being thwarted, whether or not thwarting that is a good thing, even if it doesn't feel like it short term, it might be a good thing long term. So there are all of these sorts of swirling challenges that we face. But what we found in a nutshell, and we published this research, it's in Policing and Society, and which is a kind of a big journal in our space. What we found that people had a noticeable difference post-program in the way that they felt about their abilities to meet these senior executive leadership capabilities. We found that was an effect that was maintained into the medium term. At least we haven't, you need to keep going for another 10 years or so. But we were able to then turn around to our jurisdictions and say, well, if you extrapolate, if you like, the value add that you get from having, engaged in this particular program, you can extrapolate based upon an expectation that these people will continue to be in the job for another 13, 15 years or whatever. You can extrapolate, okay, well, what's the value add to my organisation based upon individuals?
Oh, I see. Yes. I was going to say, maybe people in this field, not we, but people in this field need to do something like 7-Up. So follow managers from day one and follow them for 28, 35 years and see how they develop over that time and what intervention had an impact. Yeah,
what impact will following people have in and of itself? I think it's the Hawthorne effect, the psychological phenomenon where your behaviour changes just because it's being observed. So you have all these kind of confounding variables, if you like, when you try and measure. Well, okay, maybe we do follow people up every 6 years, but I tell you what, if someone tells me they're coming to check on my leadership in 2 years' time, I might be lifting my game in a way I might not otherwise be. So
I see. Well,
which is not to say that that's not valid, but it is to say that it's tricky.
Yeah.
And I don't know. And I don't know what to do about that, but I think we need to keep trying.
Yeah, sure. And that's what drew me to wanting to do postgraduate studies in this area. Is there's always a question there to be engaged with. I think where my preference lies, and it's just a preference, that you can use as many tick and flick sheets and questionnaires as you like, and you always have the perennial problem of getting people to engage with questionnaires, particularly with people's attention spans now being measured in microseconds, not minutes or hours, on a survey, that the talking to people and getting that rich data from qualitative research for me is something that is not just an adjunct to quantitative work. I think for me, that next level of thinking around where do we go with some of the thinking around leadership is in having discussions and getting people to talk about their experiences with this stuff to see what are the commonalities that come through, because all the things that you said before about, well, people will answer certain ways if you put them on the spot. There are always your limitations with any type of research method, but from a personal perspective, being able to have the conversation means a richer data set in my mind than just a tick and flick on a survey. Now, that again, I'm not denigrating those that work years on survey work. It has its place. My suggestion is that you can enhance those processes by talking to people and having questions that get to the nub of what you're trying to address. Now, with all those issues around anonymity, and you don't want people to stick their neck out if they don't want to, but I think having the conversation has been worthwhile for me. And I've been asked the question, are you doing these podcasts as a way to extend your research? No, this was an offshoot of me getting into this space. I have an interest in people. I think people is where my headspace is at, and being able to talk to someone and tease out what they're thinking is critically important to have these discussions, because we all go off and do our day-to-day jobs. And for those in areas like yourself where you're engaged in that world of leadership from your lens, your perspective, there's things that you can draw on for any industry from what you're learning. And you would hope, and I think the most effective leaders that I've encountered read literature from different fields to try and learn from other ways of doing things in their space. So CEOs that I've interviewed have said, I want to see what CEOs in similar industries are doing to me, and then in industries that aren't similar to mine, to learn from what their experiences are and how they made decisions. And that's something that that's come up quite a bit, is this underlying idea that ultimately leaders have to make decisions, and they have to have the best information they can at the time to make an informed decision if they can. Now, not in every context will you have the time to do that, but I think if you can learn from others, you can help hone your craft at making a better decision than you otherwise might have if you didn't talk to other people. And that for me, this is a personal view. I'm not basing this on any research. And why I say what I'm saying is so that you've got some context, Vicky, is mentoring is where I'm going with that. That I think I've become better at the skill of leadership in my industry sector because I've talked to some really good leaders that I look up to, and I see as role models for me, that I can ask them questions in confidence and say, look, I made this call, or I'm about to make a call. This was my process. This is my thinking. Really good colleagues will say, hang on, why are you making this call? What are you basing it on? And when you actually explain where you're going with your reasoning, they're like, no, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Have you considered something this? And just that one little bit of help might help you avoid putting your foot in it when you don't necessarily have to. And it's what it's taught me professionally and personally is I don't have every damn answer, but I know I can go to some people to try and get a better decision out when it's critical for me to make that. So yeah, I tend to draw from learning from others and try and incorporate that as much as I can into my own practice. Now, does that work every time? Hell no. But I realize that I've got to keep learning. I really like your point before, and I think it's worth restating that if leadership is important, then lifelong learning in that space is something that I think the most effective leaders engage in, because if you stop learning, I think you stop moving ahead. My personal view.
Yeah, look, and I think it's a really good point. I think what I would add to that is that what we hope to achieve at AIPM is create reflective practitioners. So I think there is value, very genuine value in mentoring, genuine value in having a cadre of trusted colleagues or friends, or that can be critical of you and give you some full, frank feedback, and can also, I guess, be a safe place for bouncing ideas around. Absolutely. But I wonder if actually we fully maximize our ability to learn from ourselves as well. And so by being reflective, I guess what you're able to do is learn also from your own experiences. So often in public safety in particular, the pace of work is such and the pressures are so high that, finding time to breathe and to just go, well, that was a terrible decision, or that didn't play out as I wanted it to, or actually that went quite well. I don't think we carve enough time. We don't spend enough time. We don't value sufficiently that part of the learning journey. So if we can, encourage folk after they've come to the AIPM to embed more of reflection in their daily lives, however that may look for them. I'm not suggesting that people carve out an hour of their diary and sit there and reflect, but, there are ways and means that you do that. Maybe you're someone who does that in the shower. Maybe you're someone who goes for a walk after work. Who knows? And honestly, who cares? But you can do it whatever way you want, so long as you do it, because I think that's learning from oneself, being able to critically reflect on the experiences that we've had and, not try and rework it in our brain to save ourselves a little bit of discomfort. So, I was a complete rock star in that meeting and, that's why nobody spoke up. And no, maybe you dominated the meeting.
It depends on the person, Vicky, I think, and thank you for bringing this up because this has come up before in this podcast series around this idea about the person who will be introspective and look at their practice and try and tease out what did I learn from that, and making time for that's important. And I think with the modern pace of work, we sometimes forget to do it, and we're all human, so I can get why that happens. I mean, the kinds of weeks of some friends have shared with me in their workplaces, you think, wow, did you get a chance to sleep? And, being always on the go sometimes doesn't allow for that reflective time, and you have to actually purposely do that to get an outcome is to make that time. And like you said, you're not going to take, I've yet to meet someone in the corporate sector that will say, I take it an hour every day for me time to think. It just doesn't happen. And I get that. So you do it wherever you can, going to the gym, going for a bike ride, spending time watching TV and zoning out, and your brain sort of wandering and doing whatever it needs to do when it's not fixed on a blue screen of a computer and so on. I guess one of the things that you brought up there about the reflective stuff as a critical, in my mind, leader capability. One of the questions I've asked people regularly, and I would like to get your take on this from whatever perspective you'd like to bring to it. Do you believe there are a set of core or key leader capabilities that make for more effective leadership?
I mean, I think we've got a range of capability frameworks in the public sector that sort of speaks specifically to that point. So there is, I guess, an accepted wisdom that must be the case, right? Because that's why we've got all these capability frameworks.
I don't like that term, accepted wisdom. I think I rail at that because who's accepted wisdom and has it been tested? And what I was going to say, sorry to interrupt, is I used to be in the public service and I saw those documents and my eyes would just glaze over, going, really, this is what good leadership looks like. And I'm thinking, wow, I've met some really good people in the public service and they tick off some of these boxes, but not all of them. So when you say accepted wisdom, I often bristle at that term, going, okay, so how often is that accepted wisdom tested to maybe help develop the next cohort of leaders? Maybe we need to follow and do something different. But the public service being what it is, so this is my view. You're working in there, so I won't ask you for an opinion, but definitely from having experienced it myself, I think the public service, at least at the federal level where I used to work, is working within a gigantic lumbering beast that I think sometimes is just going through the motions for the sake of it. And, when I was in the public service, I was very junior, so I didn't have enough nous to ask the question about, well, you've got a framework here. Is it really applicable now? Like you're more compliant, I think, when you're a junior professional. At least I was, that I would just listen to those in charge and not ask the question. But now with the benefit of some experience, whenever anyone says to me, well, we've got a framework, well, okay, I'll put it to the test and see whether or not it holds any water outside outside the system in which it operates. And I think you need those people asking those questions. Now, I'm not, again, not a critique of the people that put it together, but if somebody said to me, well, we review these things every couple of years to stay current, we want to be on top and be on the cutting edge of what these things look like, great. But if I ask the question, let's say at the state level, I don't know if Queensland have a similar framework to the feds, but if I ask the question, when was the last time this framework for skills for your SES or senior leaderships was reviewed? I don't know if they wouldn't tell me it was 5-10 years ago, or it's been there for the last 20 years and it seems to work for us, so we don't touch it. Like, anyway, I have my issues with the public sector, as you might hear, so please cut me down if you like. But I think in any sector, whether it's public sector or private sector, that I think, and I'm glad to hear you say it before, that you've got to keep learning and thinking, and part of that process is challenging existing norms to say, is this really the best we can do, or do we need to review some of our practice? Definitely in the sectors that I've worked in, I think sometimes it's taken for granted and people just assume the skill sets are there without sort of asking the question, if we don't have a framework for what good leadership, or effective leadership looks like, should we? I mean, do you need to have it at all?
Yeah, so if I could just finish my thought previously. What I was saying was that we have these frameworks in the public sector. So there is this accepted wisdom that, yes, you can kind of articulate exactly what it is that you're looking for in leadership. And yes, those are used, when we come to write our promotion pitches and things like that. Of course, you kind of tick off, yes, achieves results, has integrity and personal drive, et cetera, whatever it might be. My skepticism around those, of course, lies at what's the evidence base for having picked those. It's not with I think what it is emblematic of the fact that you have people in the public sector that are trying really hard to get a handle on what we want more of and how we might articulate that in a way that makes it a rewarded behavior, which means we might get more of it. So I can see there's good intentions behind having these frameworks, I think. And actually, maybe they are way more helpful than having nothing. I think, though, that how we're failing that process in kind of thought leadership, in academia, in people engaged in developing an evidence base for things that emerge in a capability framework, is that kind of thinking, that kind of research, that kind of empirical data is very tricky to do for all the reasons we spoke about earlier about, well, how do you measure success? What does it actually mean? So we have these theories that tell us, A, B, and C, and we can talk about transformational leadership until the cows come home, and because it's easy to measure because there's a survey. So actually, of all the leadership theories, it's the one that we have a biggest evidence base for because we can measure it, right? So, but actually, is that what we're after? Is that what we want? So maybe a sort of convoluted answer to your question, but yes, we have these senior executive leadership capability frameworks. Yes, there is a question mark over the evidence base upon which they're founded, but it's good people trying to do good things, trying to identify the sorts of behaviour we want more of in the public sector, and they need to do that. They should do that in terms of accountability for public expenditure, all the rest of it. Where we need to perhaps step up is we need to look at what that evidence base is, and that's the call out to the academic world, to people working in thought leadership, to think, well, how do we, maybe instead of starting with what's the newest theory, or maybe instead of starting with how can I test and prove the theory X, Y, and Z, or how can I make up my own theory, it should be, okay, well, these are the capabilities that the public sector sees they want. How do we actually maybe build an evidence base to support that? How can we be helpful as academics to what people in the public service are trying to do, which is trying to identify those sorts of behaviours that we want more of, because we think, know that they are good for our organisations, and by dint of that, they are good for our societies.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. And so just for the listeners to the podcast, yeah, I wasn't, or hopefully, so I will retract my statement if I need to, is around, I'm not really going for the intention of the developers of the frameworks being evil, maniacal. Hey, this is we'll see who we can exclude. It's more, yeah, I get that people are trying to get the best in the public sector. And I think one of the drivers that the public sector has that the private sector doesn't is the public sector is funded with public monies. And so you want to be able to get more of the best out of people that you can. I guess you said it brilliantly, that what is the evidence base for that? And that speaks to sometimes the gap between the practitioner world and the academic world. And I think the practitioners are screaming for that evidence-based, and the researchers, or at least from what I've seen, will say, well, how do you operationalize what you want me to do? Like, to get that data may be almost impossible, or there's such an issue in trying to get good, reliable data to support what you're talking about that it's just not doable or cost effective. And that's the other thing, I guess, when you're trying to build an evidence base, if you know, coming from the public sector myself in a previous life, that dollars are hard to find now to do research of any kind. And so you really have to make a pitch for, if you're going to do some work in some spaces, that there's going to be a long-term payoff. And I would have thought, or I would hope, that increasing the evidence base around this type of thinking in the public sector is going to have a payoff in the future, because an evidence basis should be what you base policy making on. This is the thing that I deal with as an advocate in my industry all the time, that I see governments, particularly in my state here in Queensland, I'm happy to say this publicly, that I think the policy making of the current government is a disgrace. It's not based on evidence. It's based on something else. I don't know what that something else is, but what I see in lots of fields of endeavour that I'm involved in is that a lot of times decisions are made on very sketchy evidence bases, and it's almost a philosophical bent that informs decision making or policy as opposed to real evidence. And I think one of the problems with evidence, and this is something that you can't escape, is sometimes when you get that evidence, that data, it may not give you the answer that you're looking for. And that's one of the benefits and issues with research, is you're not always going to get the answer that you want. But that's the whole point about doing research, is to say, well, what's the phenomenon, and does it really exist, or is there something else happening? And if you know.
Yeah, I mean, the whole scientific method, of course, is based upon the idea that you shouldn't be looking for the answer that you want. You should be testing against that, right? So that's the whole basis of, you know, our way of thinking about finding out about the world. So I think that's. So I think if you're looking for the answer that you want, then you've probably got the wrong mindset going into it. I do think that there's an interesting point you made about, you know, we make decisions based upon sketchy evidence, and where there is no evidence, decisions still have to be made, right? So you think about, you know, we go back to the senior executive leadership capability framework. You know, you try and make it at least benign if you haven't got, you know, you want to make sure you're not, you know, inadvertently encouraging the wrong sorts of behavior, right? So you make it benign in the absence of evidence. Now, so the reality of the world is that individuals in positions of authority are making decisions based upon sketchy evidence or sketchy data all the time. And that in many ways is one of the really challenging aspects of their role. Now, where the evidence does exist and we're still making decisions upon, you know, what we think is a sketchy evidence, well, then you've got a bit of a problem, right? So this whole evidence-based policing movement, which is a really important part of the way institution of policing across the world is organizing, it's kind of thinking about what do we do about, you know, concern X, you know, or Y, or whatever the crime of the day is. You know, there is a range of literature out there that can give you a better hint about, well, what you should do, and also probably what you shouldn't do. Now, tremendous amounts of work is being done across the world in being able to kind of collate that together and curate it in a way that makes sense, so a decision making can go, you know, I want to do something about, you know, I don't know, CCTV in you know, downtown Melbourne because, that's going to make people feel safe, or that's going to stop, I don't know, drug use on the street, whatever your issue of choice might be. Okay, so let's use CCTV. And if they kind of just blithely carry on and do that because it's a gut feel, or because, it seemed to work in this location over there, well, then you've probably got a bit of a problem, because there's a reasonable evidence base out there that is curated by something called the Crime Reduction Toolkit, which is based out of the UK, that says, well, actually, maybe it works best in car parks, but probably elsewhere, you might be wasting your time and your money. Not to mention kind of all the negative impacts it has upon community confidence, mass surveillance, yada, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So I think that where there's evidence available, public safety leaders, all leaders, have an obligation to make sure that they are abreast of that, and maybe use it to help guide their decisions, even if it's not it certainly isn't making the decision for them. But there are huge swathes of the public safety world, huge swathes of public safety leadership in which you do not have these quote unquote evidence available to guide your decision, and you are madly feeling your way through things. That's just the reality, right? That's just the reality.
Yeah, I don't dispute that whatsoever. I think I've been guilty of it, that sometimes you have to make a decision on the best available information you've got. And if you don't have that information, then you've got to go on your experience and or the experience of others to make a call. And I get it. I mean, look, if we lived in the perfect world, we'd have perfect information sources and they'd be at our fingertips, and leadership wouldn't be an issue because we'd have all the information ready to go. And I think, I don't like the term, but I'm warming to the idea that when people talk about leadership as an art form, and it's something you learn and craft over time, that it could be an art form, but it's also informed by information and hopefully your lived experience. And this is something that is always of interest to me. Particularly, I tried to initially, when I started doing the podcast and the conversations, I really wanted to break things up into emerging leaders, existing leaders, and those leaders that are coming to the end of their career, just to see if there were some differences in their views on leadership and the issues that they bring up. And anecdotally, because I'm still looking at my data now, and in fact, in 6 weeks' time, I've got a presentation about what did I learn in my first 100 interviews. So I'm busily trying to convert all my podcasts into text and then analyze that text using in vivo to try and get out what is happening in that data. And what I'm seeing there is, and I don't think I have a big enough group yet to make any concrete statements, but I've got observations. And I think what I'm observing is, if anything, experience is a good teacher, but can be a bad teacher as well, because if you've only rely on your own experience, you may be missing out on the experience of others. And that's where I think things like mentoring is a great thing, because let's say I reached out to you, Vicky, and I said, can you be a mentor? I need someone to bounce some ideas off. And let's say you said yes, and we set something up. Your life experiences will be completely different to mine. And I might blurt out some of the worst kind of crap you've ever heard. And you're going, Eric, look, step back and have a think about what you just said. And sometimes you need that critical friend to give you that sort of slap in the back of the head to go, look, think about this shit before you proceed. And I think people undervalue that significantly.
I think there's a very important role for mentoring, and there's a very important role for peer support networks and critical friends and all the rest of it. And in the executive world, there's a very important role for coaching, of course. And coaching isn't about telling you what you should do, right? Coaching is about almost reflecting your challenges back to you, helping you uncover other possibilities, helping you uncover what your initial focus is, helping you plan what your next steps may be, holding you accountable. Also, coaching can be incredibly effective for. So I think when you think about executive leadership development, there are a bunch of things that is not just about learning what the latest theories are, or thinking about what the evidence base says. There's a whole bunch of practical stuff that you can do around coaching, embedding coaching in a kind of leadership development continuum, developing peer support networks, which can be as, if not more useful than some of the content that's delivered on leadership development programs. Having been both a student and a teacher on them, I heartily recognize that. But being able to, you can only really benefit from any of that, right, if you're a reflective practitioner. Because if you think you've nailed it, and actually you're helping everyone else. You don't need any help. Thanks very much. I've got this all sorted. Well, then you're not going to gain anything from those. It doesn't matter how long you spend in a coaching relationship. It doesn't matter how long you spend engaging in conversations with your peers. You need to approach every conversation really as an opportunity to, test ideas, reflect, get some critical feedback. And I think if we at AIPM can equip our public safety leaders to engage in their leadership work as reflective practitioners, and I think we've probably equipped them to get the best out of their lifelong leadership journey.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it, and it's, I guess, not all industries have this kind of setup. And one thing before I lead into the last theme that I'd like to ask you, I won't let you go away without asking this last question, just to get your perspective. But I think before I get to that, one thing to say around a life lived thinking about this stuff, or at least this is where I'm heading in my headspace, is that when I've asked people, do you think in your industry sector, whatever it is, and I've asked many different people this in many different walks of life, do you think we have fit for future leaders in our industries? 99% of the time, the answer is not yes. And when that's not a yes, for me, it creates opportunities to keep having conversations about, well, if you don't think we have fit for future leadership, then we need to do more in that space and keep talking and keep getting better at this thing. Because I think if you get to the point where you think you've got the answer and there's no more learning left to do, either you're deluding yourself, or maybe you've got that formula that everyone's looking for and you need to start marketing it, because if that's going to fix all our problems, then great. But I don't think that exists, that there is no magic, there is no silver bullet. Like going back to the start of our conversation, there is no one grand theory that explains what leadership is, and the reason for it is all the things that we've been discussing. It's nuanced and it's about people. If you can accept that leadership is about human beings, then we're all flawed and none of us are perfect. So if that is a truism that people can accept, then people will be talking about this long after I'm buried 6 foot under. So I have no delusions about that, but I reckon if I can add something to that space and keep the conversations happening, it keeps the grey matter ticking over, because I've learned a lot just from this conversation. And I think that the challenge always with this is that, and I want to do this a lot more as the podcast develops, is to get people that I may not necessarily agree with to come on and talk to me and challenge my thinking, and I can challenge their thinking, because I think you get a lot more from the conversation than not. And I don't mean argument, I mean having a conversation around what this means.
There's something you said about whether or not we've got leaders fit for the future, and what sparked a thought in my mind is that leaders and their leadership is impacted by the system in which they operate, and also has the capacity to rebuild that architecture, to rebuild that system as well. So there is this kind of dynamic between, when you think about do we have the leadership that's fit for the future? I think about, well, do we have the institutions that are fit for the future? And I think that there's this really interesting dynamic. You might be getting the leadership that you need in your current institution, but whether or not your institution is fit for the future is perhaps a separate question. And I think about where you very first started, and you spoke to people about your listeners about the ongoing impact of COVID, and at some point, things will be different and life will feel better again. And I think about, it would be interesting to look at those institutions that take COVID as an opportunity to rethink their role, to bounce forward, versus those institutions, and I mean that broadly to encompass all organizations who are just kind of hanging on for grim death and can't wait to bounce back. So I think it'll be an interesting kind of observational experiment into the future. Those organizations that bounce forward and are therefore perhaps as institutions fit for the future, and therefore maybe need to have a different type of leadership for the future. And those organizations that make the choice to bounce back, and maybe they have the leadership that's fit for their institution, but maybe not fit for the future, if you see what I mean.
Sure. And again, learned something there. I never thought about the institutional side of things. I think when you talk about leadership and the context in which it happens, I think that's a massive issue. And do we have the right institutions? Wow, that's a whole nother series of podcasts we could get into. And we won't go down that rabbit hole, but enough to say, I think what you're saying resonates with me. And Vicky, last question, and I ask this in every podcast, so I'd love to get your perspective on this. It's a nature versus nurture question. Are leaders born or made?
I suspect this might be another one of those questions where I roll my eyes and
That's
say,
okay.
"Oh
That's
God,
okay.
does it matter?" And in many ways, it doesn't matter. I'm not entirely sure it matters. But then, I'm coming at it from an applied perspective. I think that the psychological literature and the developmental psychology literature is pretty clear that it's a bit of both. We are shaped by our genetics, but we're also deeply susceptible to the impacts of our environment. So I suspect, by extension of our, going back to your point, that leaders are human beings, at least at the moment, going back to that point, then of course it's going to have to be a bit of both, right? Because who we are, the way we choose to engage with the world, the way we choose to form relationships, the activities we choose to engage or not engage in, those are all based upon the development of our psychology, the development of our personalities, the development of our identities, our sense of self. And so inevitably it has to be a bit of both.
I thought that's how you might answer. One thing that I found in a podcast I recorded just this week, I asked a question and the person said, "There's two more bits to that question." I said, "What?" And Mike House recorded a podcast which said it's also about the idea of individual choice. Do you choose to be a leader? Do you choose not to be a leader? And we all have that capacity to make that choice. And then you touched on this a couple of times about being a lifelong learner. If leadership is about being born or made, and if it is a bit of both, then if that lifelong learning element is not there, then maybe longer term you'll have less effective leaders. If you choose to turn your brain off and not learn as you go, you could face being stuck in a time warp, so to speak, about your own practice, and that's fine if you choose not to do that. But I don't think it bodes well for effectiveness, and I don't think there's anyone that plays in these spaces that doesn't learn something at some point, whether they're aware of it or not. Because you can, what's the term? Is it tacit learning, or that unconscious learning that you'll do just by living and being a human being? Whether you recognize that as learning or not, I'm not sure, but I'm in agreement. I think it's a bit of both, and there is a lot of literature to say that that's the case. I don't think I've had anyone answer it's the extreme of one or the other, but if they did, the whole purpose of the question is I'm just interested to hear what people have to say, because maybe I'm at the point now where it's like it doesn't matter. As long as we've got good leaders or we can develop them, however they get there, we just want good leadership, and that I'm all for that. Vicky, thank you for your time. This has been an awesome conversation. And this is, for those listening, me and Vicky had some discussions before the podcast about how this was going to play out. And this was a very interesting conversation. It's made me think about some things. And hopefully for those listening, you can draw something from this. So for those listening, I've been speaking to Dr. Victoria Herrington, the Director of Knowledge with the Australian Institute of Police Management. Vicky, thank you for your time.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No worries. For those listening, this has been Talking Leadership. Thanks for following the podcast, and I'll catch you all on the next one. Cheers.